Hi, Jim.
Hello, Will.
How are you today?
Tolerably good. It's a bit hot and humid in New York, a typical stultifying day. But other than that, I'm pretty chipper.
Do you have air conditioning?
That's a long story. Not at the moment. It's a bit like the black hole of Calcutta in here, which is, if I seem delirious at times, it's not because of my own lack of cerebral capacity. It's purely the ambient temperature.
Yeah, the heat gets to you. Well, Jim, welcome to Free Will. I'm Will Wilkinson at the Cato Institute, and you are Jim Holt, the author of, I'm going to hold your book up to the screen now, Stop Me If You've Heard This, A History and Philosophy of Jokes. And tell us a little more about yourself, Jim. What else do you do other than write books about jokes?
Well, I actually rarely do anything like write books about jokes. This is a sort of an anomaly for me. Mm-hmm. I normally write about science and philosophy, and I write for the Times Magazine, and I've been writing for the New Yorker for about 12 years, and various other places. And my greatest interest, perhaps, is philosophical cosmology, why the universe exists, what happened before the Big Bang, and so forth. And all of this cosmology actually borders on jocularity at times, and so there is a sort of relationship between these two interests. But now this is a book that it's a very short book, and as a matter of fact, you just confided in me that you had finished reading it only about 3 minutes ago.
And I said, that's right. It's very thin. It's a delight.
It has pictures, too. It has pictures. But what's interesting is, and you began reading it about sort of a half hour ago, I think you said. Mm-hmm. And I think this is wonderful. People keep telling me that they've enjoyed the book. They've read it in the bathroom. And I don't know why people have to reveal this to me. But
I think that's supposed to be a compliment.
I guess so.
That people want something that that's appealing, that passes the time. While and there is you mentioned that genre of jokes too, the Here I Sit genre. So maybe it goes in there somewhere.
Right. The thing is that I think it was Andrew Sullivan told me that he was reading it in the bathroom, and a week later he said he was still reading, and I said, Andrew, it was written to be read in one sitting. Anyway, we can pass on it in silence.
Well, speaking of English expatriates, it's blurbed on the front of my copy by Christopher Hitchens. It says, "A book of wholesome fun for all the family."
Yeah, that's quite misleading.
That's completely false, because it's full of
filthy,
bawdy,
blasphemous jokes,
ribald humor. And not appropriate for children. So
not appropriate for children unless the children are highly educated.
Sorry?
Unless the children are very highly educated. If your child has read a lot of Wittgenstein and Freud, this may be the book for your child. But otherwise, no, it's not really for children. And this is Christopher Hitchens displaying his puckish humor yet again.
So what got you interested in jokes? I mean, you said you're interested in cosmology. And, that doesn't really go together for most people. I mean, unless you think the universe is a joke.
Well, actually, I'll get to that. I think the end of the universe is a joke, but we'll get to that later. Now, what got me interested was actually the phenomenon of laughter. Laughter has always seemed to me to be the most inexplicable phenomenon. The fact, if an extraterrestrial ethologist came to Earth and watched us, humans interacting and talking and so forth, I think the extraterrestrial would be quite amazed to see us every once in a while stopping and emitting these sort of spasmodic gasps that look almost like having a seizure. And so the question is, why is it that a certain kind of cerebral stimulus, say a joke, which is, basically it's an intellectual thing, it's a thing of understanding, why should that issue in this weird laughing reflex where your respiratory system is being pulled in two different directions at the same time? And, it involves 15 different facial muscles and so forth. How did this thing evolve? And how did it, and, clearly it didn't evolve because our distant ancestors on the African savannah were telling jokes. So did it have some sort of evolutionary function? And if so, what was that function, and how did that function get hijacked by humor? So this was one of the things that, has always puzzled me. And then about a few years ago, 5 years ago or so, the New Yorker asked me to write an article on the history of jokes for a humor issue of the magazine. And I thought, this is the perfect opportunity to look, to acquire data for a theory of laughter by looking at the history of jokes. And I thought, maybe the joke itself has evolved over the centuries, over the millennia. And of course, I had hoped that there was already an existing history of jokes that I could find in a library, and I could just crib from that. Yeah. And then, to my horror, I discovered that there was no history of jokes, and I had to produce it myself. And so it was it was like writing a doctoral dissertation in 3 months. In any case, but I did that, and the article came out, and then in the process, I had amassed a great number of philosophical reflections, psychological reflections on jokes, and then I made a shrewd commercial calculation, and I said, I'll slap it into a book, and maybe it'll end up next to cash registers at bookstores, and people will buy it on impulse.
I think people like small books.
I think it gives you, if you've finished a book, regardless of how short it is, you can make that little tally mark in your in your culture diary. And I'm in the middle of Ulysses now, which
oh yeah,
yeah,
I've been in the middle of Ulysses for about 15 years, Jim.
Listen, my strategy: 10 pages a day. You can defeat anything if you approach it at 10 pages a day. I read all of Proust last year. Then I read War and Peace, and now I'm rereading Ulysses. And I'll never read a serious modernist book again after that. But anyway, back to jokes.
Yeah, I mean, you're just like, submerged in the funny, aren't you?
Yeah. I'm just showing off my culture. I have very little to show off, so.
Yeah, well, I'm impressed. One of the things that was sort of notable to me, just reading the beginning of the book, was I guess it hadn't occurred to me that the joke as a form is a kind of contingent historical invention. I mean, maybe people were always telling jokes, but a joke is a specific thing that's different from just like a tale or a humorous story. So everybody, people have always, amused one another and laughed. But the joke, what's distinctive about a joke?
What's distinctive about a joke is that it's not only short, but as Freud said, it's too short. It has a sort of arrow-like swiftness, and it has actually too few words. That's when you begin a joke about a guy walks into the bar. Bartender says. You don't say the bartender says. You cut out every possible extraneous word, and so it's the quickness and the swiftness of the joke that's distinctive about it, I think, and that's why jokes culturally seem tied to cities, to urban civilization, and so when you have eras like in the ancient era in Rome and Athens, apparently there was a very lively joke culture. I actually found the one surviving collection of ancient jokes, which we could talk about in a second. And then the joke, seems to disappear in the Dark Ages. At least, there are no surviving collections of jokes, and instead, people tend to tell longer stories, humorous parables, and when they're not living so much in urban, in the quick rhythms of urban life.
They've got plenty of time.
Yeah, exactly. Then with the Renaissance, suddenly you have commercial civilization rising again. You have the faster pace of city life reasserting itself, and then you see a really curious development. The humorous story, which I think was the main form of the main stimulus to laughter, say in the Middle Ages, and also in the Arab world, tended to cultivate this kind of humor. The humor story, on the one hand, became shorter and swifter and more joke-like with the faster pace of urban life in the Renaissance and commercial life and so forth. And on the other hand, it developed into the longer novella and ultimately the novel. So basically, you've got the quick oral story forking often onto the one side onto quick jokes, and then the other side into more expansive narratives. What we would today call the novel. So this is sounding really dull, like a doctoral dissertation, isn't it? I'm sorry.
No, it's fascinating.
Oh, you're too kind.
I was checking my email on my phone, but that was it was riveting. Here's something. This is just a completely random observation. I love jokes, but I can't ever remember jokes. It's a certain kind of curse. Like you hear a joke and you just like crack up and you're like, oh, that's great, and I got to remember that. And
do you remember your dreams?
Do I remember my dreams?
Yeah.
Very, very rarely.
Right. You think there's a connection?
I doubt it.
Well, that was the key to Freud. You know, one of Freud's alleged insights is that jokes and dreams have a common origin in the unconscious. And I think is it a coincidence that it's not a matter of normal forgetting? You know, when you wake up and you've had dreams, the dreams you're thinking about the dreams and suddenly they vanish from memory. They're gone, and it's that's not a normal process of forgetting something. It's as though they flee consciousness, and I feel that jokes are the same way. I mean, jokes are not. It's not that you forget them; it's that they have this sort of fugitive quality. They escape your consciousness as quickly as possible.
So what does that say about me?
I mean, your dreams may encode certain forbidden impulses that your conscious mind doesn't like to entertain. And they come out at night when you're conscious, when the sensor is kind of asleep at the switch. And the same may be true of jokes. You know, Freud said that we spend a lot of time repressing all of these forbidden sexual impulses, hostile impulses, and so forth. And the great thing about a joke is that there's something a little clever and a little anomalous in the setup that fools the censor within each of us that keeps these forbidden impulses at bay. And suddenly, the impulse in a disguised way slips past the censor, and then the punchline you realize, this is a joke about it seemed innocent, but it's about blowjobs or something like that. Yeah. And there's this sort of can we say blowjob on Blogging Heads?
You just did, and there's no turning back.
Exercice de fellation. You can always use the French; it sounds more elegant. And so there's this sort of Freud thought. There's this great outpouring of the energy that you were using to repress this forbidden impulse is liberated, and there's a great outpouring of psychic energy through the muscles of the body, and this is manifest as laughter. It's interesting. I don't think the theory is quite right, but at least explains this puzzling connection between a little story with a setup and a punchline, which is something that appeals to the understanding, and this sort of cackling, chest-heaving response that people give.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's something there's something transgressive about a lot of jokes, and there's something sometimes aggressive or pent up about them. So that would explain why I say, supposing that the false Freudian theory is true, that my censor is sort of blocking the transgressive quality of these jokes. But then I should be able to remember the completely sort of anodyne jokes, like the like what does the snail on the back of the turtle say, or whatever like that. Like what? See, I couldn't quite even remember that. Right? So why not? I mean, it's not like there's anything about that is sort of dangerously submerged in my id.
By the way, just to be disrespectful to Freud for one more moment, there's actually one very powerful bit of empirical evidence that goes against the Freudian theory of jokes. If Freud is right, it's the most sexually repressed people who should laugh the hardest at improper jokes, because they have the greatest amount of psychic energy to be liberated. In fact, it's the least sexually repressed people who seem to find dirty jokes the funniest. So that's more evidence that Freud is. But you may be very, very repressed. You may even be a neurotic, and that's why you forget jokes so quickly.
Well, I love dirty jokes, and I laugh like crazy, and I'll do anything. So so I fit the data.
That's your reputation, certainly.
Yeah.
And you cloak that in the intellectual mantle of libertarianism, I believe.
A lot of
libertinism.
No, that's libertinism. It's totally different.
Okay.
A lot of my colleagues are completely upstanding, religious gentlemen and gentlewomen, and I don't want to have my bad reputation rub off on them. Tell us a little bit about these sort of gentlemen, like, I don't know how to say his name, the guy who was the Pope's secretary, is it Poggio Bracciolini?
Poggio Bracciolini.
Yeah, here's his picture. There he is.
He was the man who I discovered was responsible for the revival of the joke as an artistic form at the beginning of the Renaissance. he was a papal secretary. He served no fewer than 8 popes. And the only thing more amazing than the number of popes he served was the number of children he had by his various mistresses. I think the total was about 20. So a very randy fellow, but a great humanist scholar. And he went around the monasteries of Europe and collected great classical works of literature that had been moldering into dust, like Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. He saved that, for example. And wow. He was a truly great man, but he worked as a secretary in the Vatican. So he spent, with the other secretaries, he spent the whole day, drafting papal bulls and dispensations and so forth. And at the end of the day, these papal secretaries would get together and shoot the breeze. They had something called the bujale, or the fib factory, and they would tell jokes, most of them not a little bit blue. And he actually published a collection of these jokes, and it circulated throughout Europe. And the Vatican, the Pope didn't seem to mind. There was never a word of condemnation from the Vatican. I'll give you an example of one. One was about a preacher who was preaching a sermon on the evil of adultery. And he said, adultery is such an abominable sin that I would rather sleep with 10 virgins than one married woman.
Cool.
Yeah, and Poggio added, many who heard him felt the same way. This is sort of a typical joke. I mean, that's about as randy as they get. But another one, actually, a version of the joke turned up on the American TV show Curb Your Enthusiasm. Have you ever seen that?
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan.
Really? I would have thought it would be over your head, but do you enjoy it?
It would be over my head?
Yeah.
Larry David?
No, I'm just thinking that libertarians they don't have that kind of kink in their psyche that would enable them to, but maybe I've been misinformed. Anyway, as you mentioned, that's pretty neurotic. I was told this would be a roast, so maybe I shouldn't use this bureau. Anyway, so I'm
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Anyway, so in this Renaissance collection, a man asks a woman, he said, look, men and women supposedly get equal pleasure from sex. So why is it always the men who have to chase after the women? And the woman says, well, I'll tell you, we women, we're always ready to go. But and you men aren't always in the mood, so we let you do the asking. So this is the idea that, women are the really, they're the sexual beasts, and men love this idea. Yeah. And so on Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry and Cheryl were lying in bed together. And Cheryl said, Larry, why is it that whenever we have sex, I'm always the one who has to initiate it? He goes, we men are always ready to go. Just tap me on the shoulder when you want it. And I said, holy cow. I didn't say holy cow, but I said something analogous. This is the same joke that was in this collection from the Renaissance.
Yeah, and it's not really very funny when Larry David does it either, is it?
No. And actually, I then added an additional layer of non-humorousness when I retold it. But what the striking thing about that is that the anthropologists like to say that it's the same jokes that are getting told and retold over and over again through the centuries, and that nobody really invents jokes. They're just retransmitted. And structuralists say there's this sort of finite set of joke elements, and if you do the combinatoric arithmetic, you come up with 256 possible joke types. And so all the jokes that are being traded on the internet now, or being sent around by Wall Street traders, are just new versions of the essentially eternal jokes. And I'm not sure I believe this, but we don't necessarily have to continue on this thing. But anthropologists will always say the same thing. And I think if that were true, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it just seems like you could make up a new joke like tomorrow.
And because jokes don't fossilize well, I mean, jokes, in at least until the internet, a joke would be told and then it would just go into the ether and disappear. And so the only thing we have to go, when I try to write a history of jokes, I have to go back and say, well, there's one joke collection surviving from ancient times, that's great, and there's this joke collection from the Renaissance, and then you start seeing lots of joke collections in the 18th, 19th centuries, and then in the 19th century, suddenly there's this wave of priggishness, and all the dirty jokes are suddenly improper. And so the dirty jokes aren't being recorded anymore. And it's only in the 20th century when you had a few sort of brave people who were willing to write down and publish the dirty jokes, back when you could get in trouble with the decency police for doing this. And in fact, there's this one great man named Gershon Legman. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about Mr. Legman. He seems like a fascinating character.
Absolutely, he was. Gershon Legman lived from I would say around 1920 to about 1997 or 98, and he was an amateur psychoanalyst, an autodidact, and an amazing scholar who came to New York out of rural Pennsylvania. His father was a kosher butcher, and he educated himself in the New York Public Library, and he began collecting dirty jokes from every possible source he could find. He would go through men's rooms and Greyhound bus stations, and that sort of thing, and produce these two
some great
massive
stuff in the Greyhound station.
Yeah.
Here's something I just found in the bathroom, by the way.
Two more things about Gershon Legman before I forget.
Yeah.
He was the man who coined the slogan, "Make love, not war." And he also claimed to have invented the vibrating dildo. And thirdly,
God bless him.
And he also introduced origami to the West. Three rather great achievements.
Weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was hounded out of the United States by the FBI. He and his wife went to the south of France and lived in the ruins of a Knight Templar's castle.
Somebody needs to make a movie about this guy.
Indeed, yeah.
Or make a statue.
He also had an affair with Anais Nin. And he worked briefly for Alfred Kinsey, but he was the sexologist. But he was fired because I think he was embezzling or something like that. And he also wrote $1 a page pornography for a rich Texas collector. Enough about Gershon Legman. But no,
$1 a page.
$1 a page. Yeah, that was the going price.
Pretty good back then, I think. I don't know what that is, like adjusted for inflation.
Yeah. Better than the stuff you read, I'll bet.
Yeah. I don't get $1 a page.
And I can't give you any examples of Gershon Legman's of the dirty jokes he collected because they're. I don't think that they would even be permitted on Blogging Heads, even with these loose standards.
Oh, I don't know. There's got to be one that we can find. Let me see.
No, it's impossible.
It's
unless four-letter words are allowed.
Go ahead.
You sure?
What? Hey, it's like no skin off my back. Okay.
A guy walks into a bar and sees a woman he likes the looks of, and he walks up to her and says, "Hey, babe, want to fuck?" And she says, "Your place or mine?" And he says, "If it's going to be a hassle, forget it." Sorry, I tend to murder these jokes. I apologize.
No, that's anyway. Pretty funny. I mean,
well,
actually, I read that and I kind of didn't get it, and I was like, was the idea that he wanted to do it right now?
Yeah, I told this to a
see
friend
that explaining jokes is like the worst thing you can do.
Yeah.
It's like an act of violence, but
yes, we murder to dissect. Yes, I told this joke to a longtime American expatriate in Paris once, and when I finished it, I was expecting him to laugh a little bit. He was stony-faced, and I said, "You didn't think it was funny?" He goes, "What does hassle mean?" Anyway, so it's a little bit cultural specific. So back to the changing standards of humor. George Carlin died a couple of weeks ago.
Oh yeah.
And he was the very first host of Saturday Night Live back in I think it was October 11th, 1975. He hosted the very first one, and so Saturday Night Live rebroadcast that this past Saturday, and I happened to watch it, and I was very curious whether the humor, this is 33 years ago now, if my arithmetic is correct, whether the humor would still work for us, whether it would be funny or whether it would seem kind of low IQ relative to the Saturday Night Live we have today, which is all written by, we're told by Harvard graduates. And so I taped it, and I can't say it that late anymore. I taped it and I watched it. And you obviously...
You taped it? Like on a reel-to-reel or something?
I taped it on my VCR.
You still have a VCR?
Yeah, I taped it. I programmed it in Fortran, which is an old programming language.
Whoa.
What was strange about it was how much more sophisticated the humor was than the humor today. I mean, it was like watching a Beckett play compared to the current Saturday Night Live. All very absurdist, and even John Belushi was very sort of restrained and spare, edgy stuff. And I thought, have we really lost that much sophistication in 3 1/3 decades?
On network television, there's a billion more channels now, so the market's been segregated in a much different way.
Yeah.
And so that has to cater to it's got to appeal to a broader audience in order to exist. When before, if it could catch that sort of sophisticated, savvy demographic who is staying up late to watch something hip and edgy, was big enough to make it go.
Right.
But those people don't watch network television anymore.
Right. Another thing, by the way, another difference is that the humor on Saturday Night Live in 1975 was, almost hyper-intellectual compared to the humor today. There was no scatology. There was no. I mean, there was sexual humor, but very sophisticated. Compared to the sexual humor of today's Saturday Night Live is extremely broad and extremely coarse. And so I have this theory, that the joke has been evolving from prehistoric times up to the present, and actually taking a progressive direction and moving away from sheer filth and sheer nastiness and sheer aggression towards a sort of more intellectual enjoyment of incongruity, of witty paradox and so forth. But this, of course, just looking at Saturday Night Live over 3 decades defeats my theory, which is a very beautiful theory, once again defeated by an ugly fact.
You had sort of a Whiggish history of jokes, where it was sort of some dialectic process of the joke-geist was going to generate like the funniest joke of all time at some point, like the end of jokes.
Well, I thought that the telos of the evolution of the joke is the Jewish joke or the philosophical joke. But just stepping back a little bit, you have these 3 moldy old theories of humor, of what causes laughter. There's the superiority theory, which goes back to Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, who said, we laugh when we feel a sudden glory at the humiliation of others. So the superiority theory, it explains why we make jokes about drunks and cuckolds and racial jokes and jokes about gays and foreigners and so forth. Because all jokes are really sort of
what do you call a guy with no arms and no legs at your door?
At your door? I don't know.
Matt. Yeah, see, for some reason I remember those jokes. Like those jokes and dead baby jokes were huge when I was like in elementary school. What do you call like a woman with one arm and one leg? Eileen.
Eileen,
things like that. I don't know. I remember those.
Yeah,
but I can't remember actually like funny jokes that that somebody tells me during the day.
Yeah, one sort of a misogynist joke that's sort of in that vein that I like is, why do women wear perfume and makeup?
What?
Because they're smelly and ugly. Anyway, so you have the superiority theory.
You like that joke?
I do indeed. It was told to me by an English woman who thought it was the funniest thing she had ever heard, and so I felt it can't be that misogynist if women can actually enjoy it. So we have the superiority theory that explains basically aggressive jokes about disliking outgroups. And then we have Freud's sex theory, the so-called release theory, that jokes are about a release of forbidden impulses, and usually sexual ones, but they could also be hostile impulses. And so this would explain this explains body humor, explains it's all based on bottled up lust. Then finally you have the incongruity theory that says that what the essence of humor is sort of pulling two things from completely separate conceptual compartments together and finding this unexpected resemblance. And so that the incongruity theory makes it into something intellectual, and it makes it into something respectable, and it's a kind of art. And so I think a typical joke usually has elements of all three. It'll have a little bit of sex, a little bit of superiority / aggression, and a little bit of sheer delicious nonsense. And so I was hoping that over the course of time, the incongruity element or ingredient would sort of win out over the other two. And this seems to be in the Jewish joke, which is usually a joke about involves the mockery of language and logic itself. That's where you tend to see the purest expression of the incongruity theory. A good example of that, by the way, is I've been obsessed with the question: why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything at all exist rather than sheer nothingness? And there was a great man named Sidney Morgenbesser, a philosopher at Columbia, who was famous probably above all for his zingers. He was like Socrates on crack. He had this marvelous absurdist sense of humor. So a student approached him one day and said, "Oh, Professor Morgenbesser, why is there something rather than nothing?" And Morgenbesser said, "Oh, even if there was nothing, you still wouldn't be satisfied." It's a really good. I mean, it's laughter in the face of the deepest incomprehensibility, and there's no aggression in it. There's no sex. It's just sheer, wonderful incongruity. A lot of the Talmudic strain in the Jewish humor is like that. But then again,
so I mean, what explains? So I mean, you mentioned this fellow Legman, and then there's another sort of like a great compiler of jokes, Nat Shmulevitz.
Yes, Nat Shmulevitz, who was an attorney in San Francisco. He was actually the defense attorney for Fatty Arbuckle. For those of you under the age of 80, Fatty Arbuckle was a famous film comedy star who was accused of murdering a young starlet in the course of a drunken orgy. And Nat Shmulevitz was his defense attorney and got him acquitted. But what Nat Shmulevitz really loved to do was collect humorous ephemera. So he created the largest library of humorous writing, everything from Mad magazines to ancient joke books. And it's all in the San Francisco Public Library. Very interesting collection. The man himself had very little sense of humor, apparently.
Now, was Mr. Shmulevitz a Jewish fellow?
He wasn't. Are you trying to develop a little inductive generalization here?
Yeah. I'm just wondering because I mean, so this book is about humor. There's a lot of discussion of Jewish jokes, and I mean, partly because of Freud. So Freud had his theory of jokes, and his favorites were Jewish jokes. Himself being a Jew, and then you talk about a particular strain of humor, like this Talmudic humor, and then it's just a fact that tons of like famous comedians are Jewish, beyond their proportion in the population, I'd imagine. Mm-hmm. So why are Jews so funny?
Yeah, it's like, if you want to enumerate Jewish comedians, it's easier to do it the other way and to enumerate non-Jewish comedians. It's the same thing with great violinists. It's easier to name the non-Jewish great violinists. But, there's, one theory is that the more neurotic you are, the more fertile you'll be at producing jokes. I mean, this is actually Freud's theory. I don't entirely buy that. But I think that there are two aspects to it, I would say. On the one hand, the Jewish people, the classic out-group, and they make jokes about themselves preemptively because they're being they're always the next pogrom might be right around the corner. So they're sort of it's a kind of gallows humor in effect, and in laughing about themselves, they manifest a certain I would say jaunty superiority to other ethnic groups. I mean, there's something kind of brilliantly self-critical about Jewish jokes that, in a way, makes it better than most other ethnic humor. And then the other reason is this sort of Jewish, the Talmudic tradition, the interest in logic and language, and a certain playful attitude about it. I have a terrible feeling that what I'm saying might sound deeply anti-Semitic,
I think it's philo-Semitic.
Philo-Semitic. That's good. Yeah, I'm a philo-Semitic. I'm an honorable Gentile. I think that's a term.
What was the one you have in your book? For some reason, this one made me laugh out loud, which I think it was in the section on sort of like told me, I don't know what it was on, but it just reminded me of like a Jewish mother joke, which was like this woman's son is sort of washed out to sea.
Oh yeah, the grandmother is watching her grandson playing in the surf, and suddenly a big wave washes over him and takes him out to sea. And she falls on her knees and said, "Oh God, please save my only grandson. Please save him." And another wave comes up at the beach, and the child is returned. And she looks up to heaven and said, "He had a hat."
I love that. I don't know why. He had a hat. That's just great. It's just the ingratitude is amazing.
I think we should credit that to the comedian Myron Cohen, whom I otherwise know nothing at all about. By the way, the interesting thing, I mean, an issue with jokes is the morality of telling jokes. Is it possible, Oscar Wilde famously said, there are no moral or immoral books. A book is either well written or it is not. That is all. But I wonder, could the same thing be true of jokes? There are no moral or immoral jokes. A joke is either funny or it's not. That is all. So
can't possibly be true.
Well, I don't know. If you look at the worst sorts of jokes, I mean, the most loathsome jokes that I've come across, certain racist jokes. There's a famous joke which I can't tell. I'll have to paraphrase the way the New York Times did. It was told by Earl Butz, who you may remember was the Secretary of Agriculture under Richard Nixon.
I certainly don't remember.
Yeah. Earl Butz is actually now a villain anew because I think he's responsible for the dominance of corn in American agriculture.
Oh, yeah?
Too. So I think the foodies all hate him for different reasons.
He does have like an intrinsically funny name.
Earl Butz, yes, and he just died a couple of months ago. He lived to the age of 99. He was the oldest living former cabinet secretary. But Earl Butz had a propensity for telling improper jokes, and once on a plane, on a commercial flight when he was Secretary of Agriculture, he was overheard by John Dean, actually, telling a joke about, a racist joke about blacks. And the paraphrase of it is, the only three things a black needs are loose shoes, satisfying sex, and a warm place for biological functions. That was the New York Times paraphrase, rather. And this was so, and John Dean reported this to somebody who then published it in the Rolling Stone, and there was a huge scandal, and Butz had to resign. And it was about time, as far as a lot of us were concerned.
And so is your hypothesis that had it been funny,
no,
it would have been okay?
This is the thing about the joke. There's no there's no paralogical twist. It's just a clumsy enumeration of racial stereotypes. There's no art to it at all. Mm-hmm. And so it's both vile
it's just like,
and
people in Appalachia don't have teeth. Ha! It's that kind of joke.
Exactly, yeah. And then another category, and even more loathsome genre of joke, is a joke that has been current in Germany since the Second World War, the jokes about Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. And these are all, typical one would be, how many Jews can you fit into a Volkswagen? 504, 2 in the front, 2 in the back, and 500 in the ashtray. So all of these jokes monotonously turn on the idea of reducing Jews to ashes. And this professor at Berkeley, Alan Dundee's actually compiled, specimens of these horrific jokes. They're all like that, and they're completely unfunny, and they're also vile. So it seems to be in these two extreme cases, there's a perfect correlation between unfunniness and moral objectionability.
Mm-hmm. No, but the thing is, like, I don't think the Volkswagen joke is unfunny. It's kind of funny, but it's just wrong. By the way, in your book, you after telling that joke, you have the Sarah Silverman comment, which is great, which is that the Holocaust isn't always funny.
That's
a great comment. But
she said that on stage, actually, when she was telling a couple of Holocaust jokes, and the room didn't react, and she sort of wandered to the back of the stage and leaned over to the drummer in the band and said, "Oh, I guess the Holocaust isn't always funny." Actually, I just had to retell the same joke. I apologize.
Yeah. I mean, I think whether or not you think some jokes are sort of just immoral is going to depend on your sort of moral theory. I'm a kind of sort of Humean, Smithian sentimentalist, so I think that morality is about having people's moral sentiments arranged in the right kind of way, such that people will tend to live with one another in sort of cooperative, peaceful social arrangements. So in that kind of view, like, sensibility matters a lot.
Right.
And so especially if you live in and there's a reason why. I mean, there's a good joke about this that you tell. It's sort of like, how many lesbians does it take to screw in a light bulb? That's not funny, right?
Another light bulb joke I like. May I tell one more? Since it's sort of a meta joke. How many mathematicians does it take to screw in a light bulb?
How many?
One, who hands it to 12 Polacks, thereby reducing it to a previously solved problem. There aren't many good mathematician jokes, but by the way, one of the sort of positive functions of jokes and of laughter is to serve as a as a permanent critique of all of our values and conventional values. And some of the most dangerous and objectionable sounding jokes I know of are jokes made about the charge of deicide against the Jewish people. The idea that a certain idiots espouse, the Jews killed Christ, and this was a terribly dangerous idea through through
but
much
only
of
for a
human
couple
history.
days.
Come on, you killed my joke. That's the second version. And so to joke about this to a pious Christian or even to a pious Jew might seem to be the height of impropriety. But so the first one to do this, I think, was Lenny Bruce.
Yeah.
Lenny Bruce said, yeah, we killed him. The Jews killed him. We did it. And if he comes back, we'll kill him again. And I was raised Catholic, and that really bothered me, just because it's whoa, you can't say that. And then the other version of it is what you just said. The response to the charge that the Jews killed Jesus, killed God. What's the big deal? We only killed him for a few days. And this seems really dangerous.
That's pointing to exactly the point, which is that. So, and this is actually what the great sort of cataloger of jokes, Mr. Shmulevitz, thought about humor, that it could actually be something that would sort of like limit oppression, and that if you can mock things, if you can sort of deflate pieties, then you can sort of like keep a certain space open for freedom. But the point then is that people's sensibilities and what they do and don't find funny has something to do with the kind of social order that they're going to maintain. And so humor has a positive function in mocking sort of the silly oppressive pieties of our society. And that's why religious jokes are often great, because most of the time these are just people who are just moralizing, bloviating, blowhards, right? A great target for
critically
humor.
important in the Soviet Union. There's a new book out. I can't remember the author, but it's sort of a history of the Soviet Union as told by jokes that were current in the Soviet Union that mocked the whole regime.
Yeah.
The only one I can remember, I'll do it very quickly. A guy goes to Moscow to buy a new car. And he goes to the car dealership, and he chooses the model he wants. Maybe there are only 3 models, and he chooses the model he wants, and he pays for it. And the dealer in Moscow says, "Okay, the car will be ready for you to pick up in 10 years." And the customer said, "Oh, in the morning or the afternoon?" And the dealer says, "Wait, what does it matter?" And he goes, "Well, the plumber's coming in the morning." This is not in my book, but I thought it was a rather good joke.
So those kind of jokes are good. But the reason that people are like, the reason Earl Butz gets thrown out of office for that joke isn't because it's unfunny. It's because it's racist, and in a society that's full of lots of different people, some of them historically oppressed, and so on and so forth, making people realize that it's not funny to tell certain kinds of jokes is a way of reinforcing certain kinds of norms of equality that we want. I think there's always this sort of pull between trying to reinforce egalitarian norms, that you can't tell just all sorts of jokes about what dumb, stupid sluts women are constantly, because that tends to reinforce a certain kind of view of women. It does. Now,
are you working up to a punchline here?
No, I'm not.
That's an awfully long setup. I thought he's got to have a punchline.
I'm not telling you a joke myself. I think it matters. Like I think it turns out to be the fact that once you make so a lot of people chafe against sort of political correctness. I tend to appreciate political correctness myself, but one of the side effects is that it makes certain kinds of jokes more transgressive and more funny. So maybe people who really enjoy a certain kind of edgy humor, should thank oppressive social norms.
Right. No.
I don't know.
My favorite oppressed group would be the Unitarians. The Unitarians are they're these sort of earnest, questing people who try to rationalize their religion. And I've heard someone define Unitarians are people who believe there is at most one God, which I think is a very elegant definition. And so I actually have several Unitarian jokes in the book. My favorite one is, how do you protest when a Unitarian family moves into your neighborhood? You burn a question mark on their lawn. And this is sort of effective in several, it sort of diffuses a kind of a lower prejudice by mocking it through a higher prejudice. I'm sorry, I'm analyzing a joke, which is I'm not supposed to do. Actually, in my book, I quote Max Eastman. Max Eastman was a sort of a columnist and man of letters decades ago. It's completely forgotten now. And he has absolutely the best explanation of why the attempt to explain a joke is not only not humorous, but it's anti-humorous. And it's so good that if I try to repeat it, I will botch it. So please, everyone, look it up on the internet if you don't want to buy the book. It's absolutely brilliant. Anyway, what's your favorite joke, either in the book or out of the book? Or
my favorite book, I think, in the book that made me laugh the hardest was, I think I could tell this one. Let's see if I can remember how it goes. It wasn't like a set-up punchline joke. It was just Richard Nixon had to go watch Deep Throat 7 times before he could get it down pat. That cracked me up somehow.
Yeah, that's all. The Nixon administration, it'll always be good joke material. And Deep Throat. But
that's a new joke.
You can't miss.
Yeah, when that was written, that was a new joke.
Presumably, yes. And then there's a very old. There's another joke about Richard Nixon that sounded like a new joke, but actually turned out to be hundreds of years old. Do you remember that one?
Which one?
Nixon is walking around the White House, and it's the winter, and there's snow on the ground, and he's depressed, as in his usual saturnine mood, and he's walking around, and he sees written in the snow in urine, "I hate Tricky Dick." And he's outraged at this, and so he calls the Secret Service, and I want you to investigate and see who's responsible for this. And so the Secret Service makes their investigation, and they come back to him a week later and said, "Sir, we analyzed the urine, and we discovered that it's from Henry Kissinger." And Nixon says, "Oh." And said, "But we also analyzed the handwriting. We found that it's Pat's." So anyway, I think probably on that note, are we getting a little? Have we done our 40 minutes? Freud said a good joke is not only short, but it's too short, and maybe we should obey the same principle in this.
Well, I wanted to ask you one more thing, because you brought it up at the beginning, which is what you think humor is for. You raised the question like what its function is. Now there's this book that I've read and liked, Geoffrey Miller's The Mating Mind, which kind of makes it out that our sort of capacity for language and music and humor and all this stuff, it's just a big entertainment system. And basically a sense of humor is a way of attracting mates. There's something about it that's indicative of intelligence. It's a signal. All these just sort of oratorical fluency is a signal. Humor is a signal. Musical talent. All this stuff is signaling fitness. But now I don't know why that explains why it is that we find things funny, but.
There's a serious theory that it's taken seriously by ethnolinguists that the first function of language was essentially to tell jokes, to tell amusing things, and that the expansion of the human brain was all about it was sort of like the peacock's tail, but the brain suddenly expanded because it was useful in seduction, and the method of seduction was to amuse your mate, to be humorous. And of course, it's the men amusing the women. Christopher Hitchens wrote a piece in Vanity Fair a couple of months ago saying that women aren't funny, and it's not surprising because if you look at the evolution of humor, it's men who aren't that attractive trying to get attractive women, and they do it by making the women laugh. And then Hitchens had a further sort of bawdy wrinkle on this, that they want to produce. They want when the woman is leaning back and laughing, her mouth is in a certain configuration that leads to et cetera, et cetera. I think this is one interesting theory. But if you go back even further in evolutionary time, you look at chimpanzees who laugh in the wild. So this means assuming that chimp laughter is homologous with human laughter, that means that they were laughing, when the two lineages split off 5 million years ago. And so what were they laughing about? And the idea is that it's called the false alarm theory, that there's a seeming threat. The group is getting attacked by a predator, but it's only an apparent predator, and it turns out to be a false alarm. And so the member of the group who notices that first emits this sort of stereotype vocal display that is contagious, and which of course laughter is. Laughter is very contagious, and sort of spreads the signal throughout a group that what seemed to be a threat is really nothing at all. And this actually goes very well with the incongruity theory of humor. A concept, humor is about the strained expectation of something dissolving into nothing. So in the punchline, you have, I'm telling you a joke, I get you going with the punchline, and this is a sort of weird, anomalous setup. And then suddenly, and then with the punchline, it's reinterpreted, so it's nothing at all. Like the joke, why is it so hard to find the composer of the Surprise Symphony?
Why?
Because he's hiding.
I like that one. Oh, here's another one in that vein that I liked, which was a knock-knock joke. Knock-knock.
Who's there?
9/11.
9/11 who?
You said you'd never forget. I think that's a great joke.
That is a good joke, and I think that also is a little bit therapeutic for society. Yeah.
That's a good incongruity joke. Eh?
Yeah. By the way, I think that, the idea of a joke being the something of the setup turning into the nothing of the punchline. This is the absolute last thing I'll say because it's so pompous. Neither of us could top it in sheer pretentiousness and pomposity. I always thought the end of the universe, when the universe either winks out into nothingness in the big crunch or dissolves into nothingness in sort of the big chill, it has the logical form of a joke. And I like to think that our descendants, millions and billions of years from now, will sort of treasure that as the ultimate cosmic joke. That the whole thing, it seemed like a big something, but it's nothing. Ditto for life. That's why you can, laugh in the face of death. That was even more pompous. That's someone said, laughter is joyousness in the face of our finitude. I thought, gag me with a spoon. But
well, that reminds me of one of your examples of the shortest jokes, which is pretentious. Moi.
That's a good way to end. The shortest possible joke. 2 words. Very nice talking to you, Will. And,
nice talking to you. Your book is Stop Me If You've Heard This, A History and Philosophy of Jokes. Thanks for coming on, Jim. Your book is a delight, no joke.
Okay, take it easy.
You too.